Today I'm here with Tegan, Cosmic Creeper,
Hi.
and we're doing another, I think our third Tarot Beyond Tradition.
Yep.
Yep. And today we are talking about court cards. So that's an exciting one.
Yes, and requested as well. So we are listening to the requests and we're getting them in.
Yes. If you have requests, comments below, you know the drill. Like, we will do our best to talk about them. We might rock the boat a little bit in some of the things that we say, though, because this is Tarot Beyond Tradition. So we will talk about maybe traditionally what courts have represented and then how we see them, which is non-traditional. I mean, shocker, right? Spoiler.
Spoiler and heads up, we both don't read them traditionally.
I think that is like kind of the key thread throughout this whole thing.
Yeah.
We were talking, we are going to do decks at some point, so keep an eye out for that because we definitely know that that's been requested multiple times.
Yeah, people are excited for that.
Yeah, so we definitely will be doing the deck ones, but this time we're going to talk about court cards. So should we talk a little bit about like traditionally how court cards are seen?
Yeah, for sure. I remember getting introduced to court cards actually, and one of the key components how I was introduced to court cards was through not only the facet that they represented people, which I'll let you take over in a sec, but the fact that they were associated with hair color and eye color, and occasionally skin color as well, but definitely more predominantly hair and eye. And oh my goodness, it absolutely threw me. It was like the one part of tarot. I mean, obviously I was very young anyway, but it was the one part of tarot that just never stuck for me, because it's like, oh, you have to know someone with blue eyes and blonde hair, and it might be a point in my life where no one like that happened to exist. And suddenly you're sort of stuck if you're given that sort of framework as to, well, how do I make that fit, which is obviously, at least in my humble opinion, not the approach to tarot. We don't want to force something on ourselves that doesn't work. I feel like there's several sort of traditional layers, and that isn't always included, but certainly even in some of like my oldest tarot stuff, it talks about the eyes and the hair. Like, wow, that's wild, because I think it was the biggest tripping point for me when I read tarot books, bearing in mind that I was predominantly reading intuitively and then told, oh, but the courts are people, and that information was in the book. And then I'd be maybe flowing for a reading in my teens and having a great time, and a court would come up and I'd be like, oh no.
Who's this person?
How do we work out what this is? And like, as a teenager, it's fun enough. If you go to school, you can sort of plot any old person in there, but it don't really add relevance or meaning. So it took out, I guess, the more depthy, purposeful part of the reading experience as well.
Yeah. I feel like court cards are the things that the thing that I hear people struggle with the most. I feel like there is the biggest disconnect between what court cards have traditionally represented to how we work with tarot nowadays. Because it's very different. And a lot of us don't read tarot strictly predictively. That's a whole nother layer we could probably get into and make a note about. But when, you know, when we're looking at sort of historically how tarot has been read and the whole court cards are people, the more older texts that I think I've read and things that I've experienced have been, there was kind of like they're actual people, like you were saying, like blonde hair, blue eyes or whatever, male or female. And then it kind of started to shift where then it was like, okay, well, it's more like personality types. I saw kind of that transition happen where it's like, it's and I still do use that a little bit in terms of how I read. Like, you know, I'll say like in my Queen of Pentacles moment or my Queen of Wands or Queen of Swords, like she's great, right? So I saw the shift to that, which I think does sort of open it up more. And then how I was taught to read is completely different and has nothing to do with a person, so to speak. This has nothing to do with an individual. And so when I first started reading tarot books and learning proper tarot, or I guess maybe I should say traditional tarot, I was completely thrown off by that whole personality thing and that whole like this card represents, you know, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman in your life. I don't have a blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman in my life. So who is that? You know, who am I supposed, like, is just some mysterious stranger going to show up? And yeah. And it made no sense to me, and I struggled with it too, because that is so far outside of how I was taught to read, because I was taught to read, like we talked last time, numerologically and elementally, which we're going to get into elements in a different episode as well. And so for me, the quartz were an embodiment of that, not a person, and not even necessarily a personality type. Although I do integrate that in some times if it's important in context. That's a whole nother thing.
That makes me think of the sort of what you were saying about the blending of them, but it's sort of being nuanced. I feel like that's what I do as well. I suppose you could argue that some of the ways that I at least will try and describe them today are sort of personality adjacent, or they could infuse that, but it's not quite that. And I feel like even the personality type, it sort of falls into a little bit of a Myers-Briggs, or I don't know, whatever personality thing people are into. I can't remember the names of the others, but there's a few of them, and I feel like that in itself is it sort of misses something where it's a little bit too specific, but in the wrong way. Because I don't mind specificity, but like you say, there is a lot of elemental stuff, and there's a lot of, I guess, embodiment invitations is one of the things that I feel like quartz sort of hits on. So it will be interesting to listen to yours and mine, because I'm curious how much crossover we have in terms of personality versus like the other way. I wonder if people did that jump as well, because personality was the next easiest thing to sort of make it a bit more genderless and a bit more accessible to people, because I think that's one of the most significant things that I've noticed about the cults, is that there is now that big opening of a king doesn't have to be a man and a queen doesn't have to be a woman, which, like you say, predictive reading, it very much was considered non-negotiable. So
yeah, back in the day. Yeah, going back to you know, kind of that traditional significators, right? That was, it's, I think it was a bigger thing than it used to be, a bigger thing than it is now. I still have a significator. I still work with one. It's not like a huge, like, hard and fast rule. It's kind of more of like a, almost, this is going to sound terrible, but it's almost more of like a jokey thing. I always joke, that's the Queen of Pentacles. She's my significator. But sometimes I'm the Queen of Swords, and sometimes I'm the Queen of Wands, right? I don't seek out my significator in a deck. I know some older readers who, like, they will find their significator, and that they will do the reading with the cards around their significator. That's fun to do on occasion, but that's not like my go-to. So it's not like a huge part of how I read. But if the Queen of Pentacles hits in a reading, I'm always like, oh, that's me. But it's kind of a jokey thing, because I'm all the queens, and I'm all the kings, and I'm all the pages, and I'm all the knights. And that's the thing that gets to me, is how it's not an external thing in how I work with it. It's an internal thing, but it's also not necessarily a personality thing. Like, I think of like a significator type of thing. And I think that, wonder if there's like been a crossover between significator equals personality type, because that's an easy jump to make. So if it's an aspect of you and your personality, then that's easier to figure out how to integrate that into a reading. If it's some random, you know, dark-haired man that's coming into your life, I hope not, right?
yeah.
I don't need any dark-haired men in my life. You just stay over there. I'm good. How do you describe, if you were describing what a court card is to somebody, how would you describe that?
I feel like they're invitations to recognize something within ourselves, qualities, energies, or calls into embodying it, depending on like the context of how we're coming to the reading. Like, I did one for myself earlier, and I definitely wasn't feeling in that space. I felt like if I embodied more of the quality, it would be beneficial for me, which is why I think personality doesn't work hard and fast as an overall either, because it's like, well, I'm not personality jumping. I'm just sort of really harnessing an aspect of that. And I feel like they're very contextually swayed in that sense. Like, I don't feel like the Queen of Wands is the same in every situation. So I definitely, I get reflections of myself meets embodiment invitations, like things that can harness and breathe life into, like perhaps more tangible qualities as opposed to sort of like concepts. I don't know if that makes sense. How would you describe it?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
It's probably
I usually
a way of saying it.
yeah. I usually see them more as, I see the court cards not as necessarily people or even personalities. Sometimes they are aspects of ourself, but like, let's be honest, like a 7 of Swords can be an aspect of self,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
You know, the devil is an aspect of self, or the 3 of Pentacles. Those can all be aspects of self. So in the sense that it is a tarot card, so therefore it is inherently an aspect of self for me, I see the quartz more as representing the embodiment of their suit and the
Yeah.
different ways that we express and represent a suit quality. Kind of general sense, like the pages are like the initiation, so that's when you're first coming into your knowledge of the suit. And there's a whole numerological thing that happens for me with the quartz too, because like the page is 11 because he's a 1, he's 2 ones, he starts over, and he's got this new understanding after going through the ace through the 10. And then the knight would be the activation, which for me is a 12. And then the queen's the cultivation at a 13, also relating to the empress, who is also a 3. And then it gets really messy. And then the king is the stability or kind of the mastery of the suit, which is a 14, relating to the emperor energy.
It doesn't feel messy to me. That makes a lot of sense. The only one I have a bit of a multi-layered, because I can definitely see that, and even see it like influencing what I've got for each of them as well. But the only one that I have a bit of a crossover with is the page, because I feel like they're a glorious combination of like, or maybe they're sort of influenced by the aces, because people get a bit then stuck between the two, and it's like, no, they're not the same. It's just it's almost like the concept of the ace all the way. By the time you get to the pages, it's then realized, actualized, and the page initiates all of the stuff that's come through from that and sort of gives life to it, as it were.
Yeah.
Not quite the same, but has that sort of potential facet to it, and one has a lot more direction and information, whereas the first one is more primal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
But otherwise, the numerology and the way you said it works, like,
yeah, I see it. I kind of envision, like, if I'm looking at a suit, I kind of envision the page, the knight, the queen, and the king, like they're kind of like up here, and then the courts or the numbered cards are beneath them, and these are all the things that they do, and these are like the embodiments of how that energy is expressed. So if I get like a 3 of Pentacles and I get the Page of Pentacles, it's like the Page of Pentacles is initiating that 3 of Pentacles energy. If it's a king, then it's like mastered that 3 of Pentacles energy. So when court cards for me come up in readings, they kind of influence or show me how I interact, engage, or embody in some senses, depending on the context of the reading, right? That suits energy, and then the number energy of whatever cards are around it, or majors. That's a whole nother. We haven't talked about majors either. We'll get to that. We'll probably need to break that one down into a couple episodes, but
no, that makes sense to me. And so I think the great part about approaching the courts in a less traditional way as well is that you do get the beauty of coming away from things that don't fit, that aren't culturally relevant or societally relevant, or like it doesn't make sense in our worlds. I think that it makes them like more vast and sort of like accessible, pliable, whatever you want to say. And I think that that's how the cults have been diversified, over the years as well. Like, I remember when I was writing up something about them the other day and getting my thoughts in, and I was saying, like, if the community is diverse and queer, so are the cults. Like, it's the whole tarot is, because it's meant to be a reflection of what makes sense to us, who we are, our community. And I think that the cults are one of the bits that it seems to be missing from the most.
We are living in a much bigger world than traditionally there was. So we see more, we're exposed to more. And I think that all comes through when talking about the courts. And I know we had mention, maybe I don't remember if we mentioned it in this conversation or prior to this conversation, but like the kings and queens no longer being like necessarily a man or a woman.
Yeah.
That's a very modern perspective, but one that actually really opens up that energy of the quartz.
Yeah, and I think the only time I really gender reference is by habit, when I'm seeing something and I'm talking about it more just like off the cusp, but never in a reading, and never is it actually contextually relevant to me in a reading either. Even if I think about it through a gender, it's not. It doesn't then not become me. It is just irrelevant. And one of the things, interestingly enough, it opened up because you were talking about sort of playful significators, and I only really chose significators in a more of a, peer pressure is a bit too strong, but people were like, what one are you? But interestingly enough, people used to ask me, what queen are you? What queen are you? And I just used to struggle answering, and people would tell me what queens they thought I was, and I just really didn't align with the energy of queens at all. And over time, what I've realized is actually and I often laugh because I have two, and I say it's probably like what I view the more developed part of what I'm expressing versus the less developed part of what I'm expressing and embodying. So mine is the Page of Pentacles and the King of Cups. And they're the two. And it was quite wild because people would just ask me constantly, what queen are you? What queen are you? And I was like, I don't know. Obviously, I see them as facets of myself, things that I can engage with, things that I do, things that I am. But just when we're talking about sort of whittling it down, which does I feel like then it does get into a little bit more of like a dominant energy, dominant personality type when people are asking that question. And it's like, I'm not bringing the queen energy is not the dominant one for me. It's interesting in that way to see how making things genderless really makes them more accessible as well. But what I liked about because you said you really just have the one key word or summary word or whatever, is that yours are very clearly energetic, where I have those. Interestingly enough, I think I have the keyword for every single one that you've said with the right chord as well. So that was I feel like some of mine fall into concepts, or they're titles, but they're more, I guess, roles that represent a way to express this, like you said, express the suit. But I do wonder if that's still a hindrance for some people in terms of, like, it makes sense to me because I already feel like I have a very intimate understanding of the courts now, so I no longer pull out 4 in a reading and go, no. I mean, sometimes I'm like, give me something else, please, as well. Let's have a little mix up, because it's the same as pulling one of anything. It's all majors, fantastic, but it doesn't trigger the same thing that it used to. But I wonder if anyone was going to take something away, if they're really learning, then some of the things that I might add as we go on are probably a little bit, people might feel they're too role-based. Like, I think that the thing that I like about yours is they are absolutely energetic at their core, so that it takes away any of that sort of predetermined bias that we have about, what a student is or what a sage is, as an example, just using like a couple of mine. So I think if there's any beginners watching this, then anything that we add, like, obviously take what makes sense and leave the rest.
Leave the rest. That's always the rule.
Always. But I think that yours have an expansion outside of that that's quite a good quality to stop people from sort of getting distracted or boxed in by that.
I think the way that I work with it, the way that I work with just tarot in general, is it's the bones. So like that one key word or that one key phrase. So like you take a page, that's initiation. and it's initiation of whatever suit. So if it's the Page of Pentacles, it's the initiation of that earth energy, that mundane, that practicality, whatever it is that you assign to the suit as a whole, and taking that as kind of like a bare bones. And then, because context is so important in a reading, it depends on what cards hit the table. It depends on your question. It depends on if you're using spread positions or not. So I use that as like, that's my bare bones. If a page hits the table, it's an initiation. Is it and then I have to look at the cards around it. Is it initiation for me, for a thing? Because it's not necessarily always a person. Maybe it's an initiation of this new project that I need to work on, or this new thing over here, or same with like a queen, which is cultivation for me. So that's like, I've already initiated this thing, I've already put it into action, so I've already gone through the Page and Knight energy with it. I'm at the Queen energy, so I'm cultivating it, I'm growing it, I'm nurturing it. And that isn't always necessarily a reflection of me or personality. Maybe it can be something external. It so depends on the reading. It depends on what I'm doing with the questions and the spread positions and all of that. I think that's why for me, when I talk about tarot and trying to like help somebody come to the who's new to tarot, like how do I learn it? I always encourage them, break it down to the most basic, because the more you add to it, the more complex that gets. And if you're trying to learn to work with a court card and you're trying to assign 900 personality types to it, that's going to be real confusing when that thing hits the table and you're asking a question about, I don't know, do I need to take my dog for a walk today? And you get, a particular court card or whatever, and you've got all these personality traits, mixed into it. If you just break it down, I think, to its bare bones, and then you can let the rest of the reading, because also, total side tangent, but if we are only meant to read that one card in that one way, why the hell do we do spreads? Why do we even add other cards?
Yeah, and why is the other ones that much different? And I think the thing is, as well, is like energy is you can apply that to anywhere, but like you say, people not so much. And I think one of the interesting things, and I'm not anti pop references at all. I love pop culture references, and we even do it with the animal gnosis stuff. Like, it's good fun. But I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend it for beginners, because I still think it boxes people into quite a strong idea of like, okay, so if I relate someone to David Bowie suddenly, and then it comes up, and again, I can't connect with that, it doesn't make sense anywhere else, suddenly I'm in a place where contextually my reading doesn't make sense suddenly. And so that's why, as you say, whittling it down. I think you're better at, or maybe just your style is more bare bones than mine. But we all know how verbose I am, so it's
mine is really, it's bones. I have bones to everything that I do, and then mine is completely also influenced by the type of deck I'm using, by the reading I'm doing. The art makes a difference. I mean, that's part of the reasons I like having so many decks, is because it matters to me. I can Three of Pentacles will read totally different for me based on the art alone, because what I'm picking up from that. And then so just kind of breaking each of the cards down into their sort of base structure. And then that allows me to let those nuances from the different cards, the spreads, the whatever, add on top of that. But I think the courts in particular are a bigger struggle for people, just because of that whole like personality layer. And we're humans, so we want to see the human in everything. And it's so interesting to me, because we say like, oh, well, it's a personification card, it's a person, it's a queen, it's a whatever. There are people, if you're using a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, on every card.
Of course.
So like, then why is that not a personality reflection, right? Why have we separated the courts out as their own thing? They're always listed, almost always listed separately in a book. And so that's interesting, because you have like the majors, and while the courts are a part of the minor arcana, they're always separate. They're a separate thing. And so back when I was first learning, I didn't understand why they were separated. I didn't understand the personality thing at all either, because I'm like, that it makes no sense to me. The actual people thing, physically people things, was totally off the rails for me. But why are they separate? Like, why is it not just a part of the minor arcana and just it's just in with it? Like, why isn't it just 11, 12, 13, 14, whatever? And I think for me personally, the way that I see the quartz is they are like mini majors within each suit.
Yeah, and that's a
And they do
good
stand
way
apart.
to them. Like if people are getting tripped up on the personality, and I think, oh, sorry, I'm wobbling my camera. I think that that's where mine perhaps sounds a little bit more personified than you in the way that I discuss things, which I think is natural for me just because of the work I do. Like I'm constantly working with people and that kind of like, I guess actually I speak about things very relationally, I think. So the language is a little bit more human centric, I guess, in that way. But I don't feel like I speak about the quartz any more relationally or person wise than I would a major.
Than anything
so
else.
when I talk about how we embody and express the high priestess, it's no different in the way that I'm talking about how we embody and express the Queen of Swords. The two things are actually very, very similar in mine, but obviously they have different meanings and they sit in sort of at different energetic levels, and there is that mild nuance between maybe more of like an occurrence or a doing as opposed to like a happening, because sometimes we'll talk about majors at another point, but the larger scale of a major is obviously can traverse a lot more terrain basically.
I think though the personality thing though, I think is actually easier for a lot of people to understand than an energetic. Energetic is it's more like intangible, right? To say something is energetically this, or right, it's that's a different thing than to say like it energetically represents the earth versus, it's a creative, caring, nurturing kind of, like when we use personified words. And I'm all about personification. Like I personify all my decks. They're all little personalities to me. Okay, well, most of them. Some of them are not so nice. And like I love personification. And I think that as humans, that's easier for us to make a connection to. And I think that that's why we do tend to fall back on the personality traits of the quartz, because it's easier for us to make a personal connection to. If I say the page energetically represents the suit of earth, that's a very broad thing.
Root into, So, but it's interesting because it's easier for us to connect to the personification, but then it's also easier to be boxed in by it.
It's kind of like they're interesting because they're both opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of one's easier to understand but more limiting, and one's harder to grasp but way more open.
I wonder if the combination of our two will find a sweet spot for people, because I feel like there's going to be a lot of crossover, and perhaps we'll do like, I'm guessing we'll go through the page, we'll go through the
we can go through them.
But I feel like maybe that will be the bit where people can draw a line perhaps and make a bit more of a spectrum, as opposed to having these two like polarities with no middle connection. And that's the thing when you're new as well, isn't it? If you can't draw a line from the thing to you or the thing to something that makes sense, that's the bit. And you were saying about learning and, not making things too complicated. I can't even say the word. And it reminded me, like recently, and I'm sure that it's not going to be massively successful, but I've been studying Spanish just really slowly and gently on Duolingo. And it's like, I was thinking about, well, it's actually going quite fast. And when I learned a language when I was obviously born, you start with the freaking alphabet and stuff and sounds, and then you start adding words, and then you start adding context and meaning and definition and sentence. And I think that that's a good way to approach tarot as well. And also allowing yourself to, but I'm biased and I think you'll agree, is have a relationship with what you're seeing on the cards as well. like than it just being like this set thing that you remember and then have to access, because that makes it a little bit, at least in my opinion, it's a little bit too rigid. And again, you fall into what about when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So I'm curious then, if we get into like the page, how do you still have like a little bit of a blurb or a way that you would sort of expand upon initiation without the element facet?
Without the element, it's hard because it does like, it's influenced by its element. But like page in a general sense, to me, it's like, it's hard to do it without personifying it, right?
Yeah.
It's because it's hard to speak about it.
More personified than yours, I thought so.
If we're gonna personify it, then I would say the pages are like kind of like they're the youthful seekers. They're the beginning of something. As an initiation, it kind of relates to an ace card. It's like there's the potential there, but the potential is in how you're going to work with it, express it, embody it, depending again on the context. So it's like if I can maybe use like a gardening metaphor, it's like a seed, right? It's like an ace seed.
Exactly the gardening keyword that I've got.
Is that? Yeah. So it's kind of like a seed energy, but I see it as more of a, because the rest of the cards matter. I see it more as a, rather than the card representing a single thing, it represents kind of like if a page shows up in a reading, there's an initiation happening within the context of the reading.
Yeah.
So it's not really about that single card or even necessarily that single position it lands in. I don't read with card positions very often outside of my guided practice that I do. The rest of the time I read very like intuitively, and I don't really use spread positions. But for me, it's the initiation of whatever's happening on the table. So if a page hits the table for me and I've got a reading going on, then I know that I'm kind of at the beginning stages of this process. So maybe I haven't even fully brought it into being. Maybe I haven't even fully manifested it yet. Maybe it's still a seed. It's still an idea. It's still a thought, whatever, again, context, whatever it is. That's kind of what the pages represent to me on the whole, is kind of like that. That's without personifying it, that seed energy. If I were to personify it, it's like, what's a page? It's a youthful seeker who wants to become a knight, right? They want to become a knight. So they have to learn, they have to study, they have to train. And so that is that kind of initiation energy. And you can think of initiation also, that word itself is used esoterically a lot, right?
Yeah.
To be an initiated, to be, initiated into something means you're not fully ingrained in it. You're not fully engaged with it. You're just on the beginning tracks of it. So that's kind of how I see it, the page energy. But for me, when they show up in a reading, it's not a person. It's not necessarily a personality type. It's more of it's kind of in telling me how the embodiment of the reading as a whole is going.
Yeah. I relate with that, but like I said, mine is, I have seed, but mine has more personification layers to it. So I also make the connection between the aces, and I think I said to you before we started, like the aces and the pages for me, whilst they're not one and the same, it's like the ace is very primal, very like we spoke about it in the numerology, like very sort of core of the suit, and then the page has got like can actualize that and do something with the suit,
do something with it. Yeah,
the ace cannot do alone. So, but together they're both sort of a curious experimental, like one of the things I've put down as well is it's like being a sponge. Like I feel like it's and when we're initiating into something, as you say, it's like we're sort of open to a lot more things, experiences, feelings, just all of that. I feel like we're in a process of diving in. It's very sort of studious. Like another thing, I've got keywords for mine, so like things like novice, apprentice,
student, apprentice.
Apprentice, that's me like trying to check my notes and make two together. Because I think that, of course, there's like an animal thing for me as well, and I feel like it's a grasping of something. When you were saying, like, if we think about moving through them, it's moving in a developmental way towards something that is perhaps a little bit more defined, a little bit more directed. But at that stage, it's just, a lot of spongy, a lot of absorbing, a lot of a curiosity. And like, I like to think to myself, like, how am I curious about this sort of in the expression of the suit? So if it was, the cups, and I was thinking about things within that, I would be looking at, like, how am I curious about it? Where am I initiating? Where am I learning? How am I being a student? Which again is falling into a little bit more of that. But as I say, I guess it makes sense to me, because I try and pick concepts that aren't too inaccessible for people, if that makes sense. I feel like anyone can be a student of something, even if you've never academically even if you've never academically trained. We're students of the earth, we're students of each other, so I like to think of things that, when I am getting a bit more personified, that are perhaps hopefully more accessible to other people as like a concept. But that's certainly how I see them. There is definitely like the ace. I feel like the ace couldn't initiate itself, if that makes sense. And the can.
The page can initiate the ace. That totally makes sense to me. Yeah.
So it's like they are, and the funny thing is, they're both like seeds to me. Like, and I know some people might watch this and be like, how can you have a key thing for one and the other? But it does. It works, and it makes sense. And also, the non-gardening gardener is here to say that my page, knight, queen, and king all have actually the keywords someone has actually used in the tarot. I think it's the gentle tarot. I think it's the same gardening type, or almost the same as the ones I've chosen.
Yeah.
But again, I think we just have to roll with like what conceptually works for us. So it's I don't garden, but here we are.
Yeah, I don't either, but I use a lot of gardening metaphors, so I totally get you. I mean, I think student/seed is, if I were going to pick like 2 keywords, like outside of our initial, like, short initiation is my main keyword for a page. But if I were going to pick 2 keywords, I think student/seed is great, because that embodies the personality as well as the energetic.
Yeah, so it's a meeting of the two.
It's a meeting of the two. So like, if we were to sit down and write a book together, like, I feel like that would be our meeting point.
Initiator and then student seed. I like it.
Yeah.
We should do that.
Come together. we should make a note of that. Student seed, because I feel like that is both sides of both potentials of a court card, in the personality as well as the energetic, and it's the kind of the meeting of the meeting of the minds, in a sense. I think that's great. We should see if we can come up with that for all of them.
Well, I have one of each for the rest of mine, and
Perfect.
You have what I feel is more the overarching, like the raw word, I feel like, is yours, and then mine is
bone.
We've got bone, and I've got like a bit of muscle or whatever.
Yeah. Bone, some muscle, some skin, put it all together, you get a person. That's great. It totally works with court cards. So should we move on to the knight then? So I feel like I do feel like there's a progression with just as I felt like with the 1 through 10 and the numerological and the number cards. I feel like there's definitely a progression. Like, the page, grows up into the knight, which grows up into the queen, which grows up into the king. And again, they're not gendered for me, so there's no gender hierarchy going on there. It's all an energetic hierarchy, in a sense. But I don't even really look at it as a hierarchy in that sense. It's more of like a progression of growth.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like gardening metaphor, seed to blossom, right?
Yeah. And same for me. It's like, it's not the 10 is better than a 3. It's just more developed.
It's just a higher expression of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sure.
So the nights for me are my kind of overarching word for it is activation. So that's for me, it's when we take that what we gained in the initiation and then we're going to do something with it. So we're going to actively put it out in the world, work with it, whatever the case may be. And I think from a like visual standpoint, when you think of a knight is usually on a horse and he's going to go out and he's going to adventure, right?
Yeah.
So
And
that's kind of my overarching.
I think that makes sense and is very complimentary. So again, if you have that as sort of like the headliner, for me, out of the ones that I've got, I think Questa is probably, because I've got like Traveler, Messenger, but I think Questa is it's like, I feel that again, even that in itself can be both experiential and a thing that we do. So I feel like it's very questing energy for me, because it's not the beginning of something anymore. Like say, there's action, there's movement, there's development through this. And the very planty bit that I've got for that is root, because and one of the things that I wrote about the roots was that it's sort of within that growth that's going on, the roots start sort of spurting off in all different directions, but not necessarily they're not out in the light. There's not one clear direction, you know. They're really almost like and this is personifying roots, to be fair, but they're trying to fulfill and access their desires and their needs, and they're just sort of going on a quest as to where they're going to get it. I don't feel like it's as clear and defined as when we move into the Queen and Kings. It's got a little bit more of a again, chaotic's a bit of a strong word, but a branching off energy about it, like a pursuit. It's, yeah, there's definitely that layer for me, if that makes sense, of like, it's not fully formed, it's not fully matured, but it's very rhythmic and it's very boundless, and something is being driven and compelled forward in that suit that we've taken from the initiation, and now we're questioning it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's cool. That's interesting, because my with the root, I never thought about it in as being the kind of the underneath and the root, because my sort of gardening metaphor for the night is actually the sprouting. So it's going up into the world. And
right, so you've broken yours. So mine will be one in front of yours, I reckon, for the Queen, but I feel like you'll understand why I've chosen it, because for this time around, instead of stopping at the bloom, I've gone one past and gone for the harvest.
Interesting.
The sort of but I guess, see, the difficulty is maybe yours will be more of a flow through expression that is just plant based, where I guess technically the harvest is something that a human sort of has to, when you think of like gathering something called deadheading or something like that.
Yeah.
But I felt like the harvest was an interesting metaphor for the king, just because of what happens with that shift between like the bloom and the nurturing. So
That's interesting.
but I can see sprouting, because again, to me, it's whilst I feel like rooting is perhaps a little bit more going in, not fully blind, but not formed, if that makes sense. The two things both have like a actionable early growing phase. Like, it's something that has to happen before we know if, I guess, it's been a successful growth, which is later. It's something we get to later, like in the Queens and Kings. So yeah, I can see sprouting, and I imagine a plant sprouting looks a little, again, very personified, but looks a little bit more knightly.
Yeah, just it's a little, I don't know, just I've envisioned like this little, we've got this seed, that's the pages, but like in the night, it's like, okay, I'm ready to go. So like it comes out of the ground and it sprouts, and it's not the fully formed plant though. It's just like the baby energy of it. It's just starting on its quest. It's just starting on its adventure. I do love quest as a keyword, like gamer me absolutely loves quest as a keyword for night. Because I think that is very much that energy of nights. It's about taking that and going out, and maybe you don't always know what you're going to do with it. You definitely are not at the end of a journey, you're just beginning, but you have kind of like if you have a quest, go gamer nerd here, you have a quest in your quest log, you know what you're supposed to do. You don't always necessarily know how you're supposed to do it.
There's a goal.
Right. There's a goal, but not necessarily a mapped out plan to get there. And I love that kind of meandery energy, which I think is represented in your roots, because like it kind of goes everywhere. There's this, you're not always on the right path as a knight either. So, and that's again context and personifying, but as when you're doing readings, sometimes a knight can come up and it's like, okay, you're taking a path and you've got this goal, but it's not always like you don't always take the right path to get to the end goal.
The wrong way. Like I feel like we take lessons from all of the cards, but I learn a lot of lessons when I'm in questing mode.
Absolutely.
Like
it's my favorite saying is like, like I'm not procrastinating, it's a side quest. Like that's like one of my favorite sayings, because I side quest through half of my life. Like I've got my main quest over here. The majority of my life is side quests. Like, let's be honest.
And I think that's a good metaphor as well, is like, actually, it's not even always just the one quest. And it could be a key thing. And even side quests, sometimes really nourishing, sometimes really distracting. Sometimes at all. So it's an interesting one to play with in terms of like, what am I questing into? Or meandering. And I think that in itself gives us a nice variation of like movement, if that makes sense, rather than just because I do feel like then when the suits come into it, some are slower than others.
Right. I was just thinking in the back of my brain, like, so that if you have a Knight of Pentacles versus a Knight of Wands, right? So the Knight of Pentacles is plodding along. He's kind of meandering. He's like, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to pick some flowers. And then maybe I'll save this person from the well. And then I'll get back to my initial quest. And, I'll get there eventually, where the Knight of Wands is like, no, I'm doing the thing. I'm going right now. And nothing's going to distract me from that.
Yeah. They're like head on.
Yeah. I know my end goal, and no side quest is gonna distract me from that. I feel like the Page of Pentacles would be all about the side quests.
Yes, the Page
and
of
the
Pentacles
loot
has like the gatherer vibe, which is where the suits come in and sort of like really nourish what way, what plant you're growing. There you go. That's what it is. The energy is what plant, whereas the fire of the Knight is like main character energy.
Main character energy, absolutely. I think it works really, really well for the Knights.
So then what's your overall one for the Queen?
So the overall arching energy for the Queen is cultivation. And that's kind of that growth energy. Nourishment, cultivation.
And so for you, mini Empress, right? So
mini Empress,
Queens, mini Empress vibes, or at least adjacent. Kings, mini Emperor vibes, which totally works for me. And I think cultivator. I'll be intrigued to hear what your plant one is, because for me, my plant one is flower or blossom. So that's yours as well.
That is actually mine as well. It's because at this point with the Queen is when like it's the blooming, it's the flowering of it, right? It's the taking the thing, you're nourishing it, you're feeding it, and then it's going to bloom out of that.
And I really like that for that expression. And I'm not sure that the key ones that I've got for it are as expansive as the first two. So with like the student and then the quester. And I'm looking at them and I'm like, well, because I've sort of got a whole thing going on. It depends how gamey you want to go versus magical versus just what makes sense in my brain. I've got sort of a whole sort of like oracle kind of vibe, seer, sage. But I also have witch, but witch is for me is like an ultimate cultivator. So I think that's why it makes sense to me. But one of the things I like about the blossoming and the flowering is that, like you said, you've cultivated it to get to that point. And also it's a really it's a point where, for me, because a lot of people talk about how it's like a fertile energy, and I feel like that can get caught up in gender, unfortunately, sometimes. And one of the things I would say to people about that, although flowers in themselves, that is like the most fertile period. But when I think about the way that I guess the power of that energy is being expressed, it's far more subtle, I feel, and inward than a king, which feels far more outward to me. And so there's something about, people talk about, again, like nurturing, fostering, cultivating, but I feel like not only are we able to do that in that energy, but we've learned, like we've successfully sort of honed those skills by then. So it's less about learning to do them and more that we've arrived at being like, what was I saying? Being nurturing, being fostering, being able to sort of have the power to influence other things from that space, from that nurturing space, from that intuitive space, from that, it's like an influence, but like I said, not necessarily I don't want to call it passive and then make it seem like, oh, it's weak to then.
Right.
Why I avoid that word, but it's just more subtle. It's more like I say, influence. I feel like it's like it infuses in the same way that a flower does. All of a sudden it's fertile, but it's colourful. It draws attention. There are sometimes smells. There are things.
It feeds. It feeds things.
Yeah. Off of it. There's like a whole thing that goes on that makes it very sort of communal as well, which I feel like is a queen facet if it's going into those relevant areas. Like if that's something that we're cultivating, it's like all of the values of the suit, all of the beliefs of the suit, we are able to live, breathe and lead with them by that point. I feel like we're fuller embodiments of those parts of the suit. It's like I suppose getting to a part of the quest where it's not been completed, but it's like I don't know, we have arrived in some ways for me. But I guess one of the things that I notice, at least for me, about the Queen and the King is they feel like perhaps less of a progression than the Page to the Knight and the Knight to the, like.
Yeah, I would agree.
Smaller jump from Queen to King, and more of a shift in what I'm doing with the thing to then I'm doing it in a different way. Like I'm expressing it and engaging with that energy in a different way. Whereas the Knight had to learn and get somewhere. The Page had to learn and get somewhere. I feel like the Kings and Queens sort of
they've already arrived.
Yeah, and they do something differently with it.
Yeah, I think it's like it's the kind of the graduation of the Page and Knight become aspects of the King and Queen. Like I feel like they even though my little planty gardening metaphor is a little less linear, I feel like they kind of sit on the same level. Like, so I don't really like the hierarchy in the whole thing because I don't see them as above each other. I see them like in a line.
Yeah, it's a movement.
Yeah.
And I think
it's a movement
what's interesting about that is, although we lay them out in a linear line, is that we can go back and forth between them as well, because shit happens, right? And then sometimes, oh no, new side quest. So I think, but I like graduate. That could be a good one. So cultivator, graduate, blossom, blooming, flowering flower.
I think that works. Yeah. The king for me is interesting because my overarching kind of keyword for that is actually stability, which in a little bit of a sense kind of contradicts my flower metaphor. It makes sense in my brain. But again, relating that king back to that emperor energy, right? It's the stability. Like, we've gone through all of these changes, we've cultivated, we've blossomed, we've grown, and now we're like present with it. And but my plant metaphor, my growing metaphor, is more in alignment with like decay, because it's reached, when we reach the king has reached, like, this is a kind of a morbid sense, but what is the full potential of life? Death. Because you've lived it. You've reached the full potential of it. So once you've reached that full potential of that experience, the only thing left to do is the decay. And then when we're looking at tarot, it's the decay, and this is to start again at a new level with a greater understanding, right? So it's an interesting, the king for me is interesting because it seems a little bit like my sort of plant metaphor and my kind of overarching energy a little bit in conflict of each other, because to be stable is not to be decaying. But in that, like, during that life cycle of a plant, right, we've got, when it's finally reached that point of full growth, it's now stable. It's done. So that full potential, then
they don't stay stable for long, do they? Especially if they're not evergreen, they do then, decay, as you say.
And they decay. So it's an interesting kind of
perennial, just beautifully.
It's kind of an interesting little combo there, because they don't necessarily at first glance look like they really relate to each other, but it's one of those things that, like, it works in my brain. I'm always like, when it comes out of my mouth, does it make sense? I don't know.
No, I get what you mean. And it's funny because whilst I didn't mention it for the Queen, I was thinking about, and I don't know why, but again, I think it just made more sense to me, but it is getting into more like roles. I was thinking of roles of the land, and I was sort of playing with the idea between the king and the queen of like shepherd for the queen and steward for the king. Not because of hierarchical roles though, which is why I didn't include it, because people would be like shepherd, lesser than. But I was thinking, to me, it's more cultivating in a direct, like, it's the first hands that cultivate, energize and nurture the land and the sheep or whatever they're a shepherd of, like shepherd. So I'm thinking of animals and land. Whereas I feel like the steward, the king, they sort of build upon that, in that that's cultivated, and then they start looking more outward into how to sort of maintain, like, what's going on, stabilize, like you said, make sure that foundationally survives, that it's fully formed in a way that I feel like they lead well, that sort of energy for me. And interestingly enough, I don't feel like, whilst yours is more plant-based in a term of they can decay without the help of humans, which is why I like yours, mine is a little bit more, it does require human involvement. But I feel like the act of the two of them are quite similar. So mine's harvest, and the harvest is obviously, it's still an end. Like,
it's an end,
and I like the concept of like reaping what we sow. If we think about terms of like being the best form of a king versus being like a troubled king, as it were, reaping what we sow. But also, I think the interesting thing about a harvest is there's the space in which we decide what it is that we sort of distribute, and what it is that we have to store as like a preserve for the next, the next thing, as it sort of swoops and does a full cycle again, if that makes sense. Because harvests, traditionally at least, when people needed harvests the most, it was like it had to give you stability, not just in that moment, but the whole way through winter. It was like you had to have that. And I feel like when people talk about kings and leading and stuff like that, it can fall into like what bad kings did, and like,
Mhm.
if we talked about gender and
Mhm.
hierarchy and
Mhm.
you
Could also
know
be a very dominant energy, like
yeah,
personality-wise, very dominant energy.
yeah. And
Isn't
so
necessarily always the case.
yeah, but it has that sort of that power element, but we can
Mhm.
sort of diffuse it from the other more biased parts or unhelpful
Mhm.
parts into, yeah, what have I got structurally? How do I distribute this versus what am I keeping? And I feel like that's
Mhm.
the harvest metaphor for me. And I think my most useful keyword in terms of versus harvest is architect, because
Mhm.
again, for me, an architect isn't someone who just make sure something foundationally works, that they make sure that it lasts.
Mhm.
I feel like there's something to take away from it. Like it's finished,
Mhm.
but there's something about it. I don't know. Like an architect always has something that they can take away that then
Mhm.
might take them down a new
Down a new road.
yeah,
Yeah.
as it were, in the same way that not every harvest is the same. And of course, once we've harvested, we do have to start again. We
Mhm.
either need to wait for the next growth cycle or plant a new seed, dependent
Mhm.
plant.
I think that's a great metaphor. It's much it has a much less finality feel to it than mine does. Like, I mean, I just see death as a new rebirth. So
Yeah,
I
it
don't
isn't
have that sort
much
of
that scares people, I think. It's more like a
yeah,
keyword versus how they deal with the metaphor.
right, yeah. This an interesting little kind of concept that happens in my brain with the king and queens is the king and queens also for me they kind of represent the sort of macrocosm and microcosm, the inner and outer,
Yeah,
in a very energetic way because I see the queens as
no.
more inner,
Mm,
more microcosm. Where like what can I do within myself to cultivate this whatever? Whereas the kings to me feel more macrocosm. Did I get that right? Yeah, macrocosm. They feel more external. They feel more like the the active versus the receptive type of active's
yeah.
not really the right word because that more applies to a knight for me, but it's more like a
It's just more accurate.
mastery.
Yeah. Yes.
It's like it's projective energy. It's like it's versus receptive energy. Is this right? I'm not sure I'm getting my metaphors right or my
I'm not
energetic
following.
I'm not sure I'm getting my energetic resonances right, but when I look at and the same with the pages and the nights, which is really interesting. So a page, there is correlation between elements and the court cards.
Yeah.
We're not getting into all that because we're going to talk elements in a different video because that's a whole nother rabbit
Yeah.
hole to go down. But the same way that the pages feel internal, they feel microcosm. I need to go inside. I need to learn. I need to grow from a sense of place inside. Is that initiation energy? Whereas the knights feel that external, that macrocosm. I need to take it out in the world. And there is a correlation in my brain between like the page and queen and the knights and kings and sort of that maybe projective active energy versus that receptive. I don't like the word passive either because it has a connotation of weakness, but that more
We'll
I
just
wouldn't
use
come up with a better
yeah.
word.
Just know we're not using it in the dogmatic way.
Yes. But I think there's definitely and I like the flow when we're looking at it as a growth, as the quartz as a growth. So you have that internal, external, internal,
Yeah.
external.
Yeah.
And that flow I think works really well. And I think that's why we have that full set of 4 in the quartz. I mean, because it comes out of playing cards and all that too, right? But that set of 4 makes a really nice yin yang balance back
Yeah.
and forth, and I think it really mimics what we as humans need to do, the progress we need to make, the growth cycle we need to go through on a mundane smaller level because we're in the minor arcana, and to me that's mundane versus major arcana is macrocosm. That's a whole nother thing, but to me I see that as this is shows us how to how to go through that growth cycle in whatever context of whatever the reading's about, and the cards that come up and all of that.
I agree. And I definitely see the same, the in and out. So inward to the outward expression. And it's not that I don't think that the page or the queen can't share that in facets. And obviously, if it is contextually relevant, that it's relational or whatever it is, I do feel like they share, but then in the way that I guess I peg it in my brain to explain to other people, which again is in my brain, it's more just an energy thing, whereas for other people, it's easier to describe it in sort of personalized context, is that they feel a little bit more, I guess, if we were to take community, immediate community versus like wider world, again, with that that microcosmic, macrocosmic. It's like, it's not that that's not an experience that's not sort of tangible and felt in and around or energetically exchangeable, but the way it's expressed is again far more receptive. It feels different, you know, if you're sitting with someone and they're holding space for us in a receptive space, we can feel the difference to that, as if we're sitting with someone and they are teaching us something, perhaps. They might still be holding space for us, but the way that they're doing it, the energy completely changes. I feel like. And the like you said, not wanting to use those sort of dogmatic words, but again, if we think about sort of dominance or the more lead that the king and, like you say, the knight has, because the knight is on the quest and the king is like, okay, well, quest fulfilled, but this is how I want, like, I guess the quest to end. Like, this is, you know, I speak on how this is finalized, structured, ends. And that's where your decay comes in as well. You know, I guess it's like I choose the ending, and that's how I see the harvest as well. Like, because I'm not running around harvesting. Well, I'm not harvesting anything because I can't grow stuff, but I definitely harvesting things that were like moldy or like, that's no use to me. That's not going.
That's no use.
Or the larder.
I think there's also, for me, there's also an interesting correlation, like between the page queen and the knight king. Whereas, and I'm going to use this word, and I don't mean it in a derogatory sense, but the pages and the knights are, to me, are like an immaturity of that energy. Like they haven't fully realized anything. So the pages are. They're the pages and the knights are kind of that immature energy, whereas you grow up into the maturity of the queen and the king. And that to me is kind of, again, shows that progression. But they do, I guess, sometimes funny until you like verbalize something, you don't think about how much of a connection that is until you like say it aloud to someone else. But there actually is quite a bit of connection for me between the pages and the queens and the knight and the kings. And I think that's because of the way that the energetic flow of them. And I think they all balance each other out really well. Like the page and the knight balance each other out really well. And the king and the queen balance each other out really well. So it's like the youthful energy. It's like the child energy versus the grown-up energy.
Yeah.
So, and I think there's a lot of decks that use like, they'll use like son or daughter as more, again, that's gendered, but they'll use more of a familial.
They'll use child and teen as well. I think child and teenager. I've seen
child and teen,
like how they try and people sort of apply age to it in terms of youth, but really what our I suppose nuance is it sounds like we're talking about age, but really we're talking about development, and development can obviously occur at any time, which is why it's the Sassorobito tarot, which has a really old wise man full. And I'm like, I don't own that tarot, but I'm like, yes, because developmentally it can happen at any point.
And it can happen at any age. Yep, absolutely.
I think that's our nuance, really, isn't it? It's a developmental youthfulness and like wanting to actualize something, but it's not fully actualized. And then, like you say, when you get to the queen and the king and how they do it, obviously complements each other, which is why we would hope that all are accessible to us, because if we're just sort of stuck in one, we're really actually lacking a quality from something that gives us a little bit more balance, a little bit more equilibrium.
Yeah, I think it's really important not to. I mean, like I said, I play with significators. It's kind of like a funny, like, gamified thing that I do, but I don't
It's
really lock into a significator because that's too limiting for me.
yeah,
I'm a complex person. Like, you know, I'm in my 40s and I still watch cartoons. So, you know,
yeah.
it's that one significator doesn't represent the whole of me, but in that moment, a court card can represent an aspect of me if we want to personify it, or how I'm engaging with the rest of the reading on the
Yeah.
table.
How you're living, breathing, being it, or how your
Mhm.
project is living, being,
Yeah.
breathing it, which
Yeah.
is why it's such a good translation as well. Because, like you said, then you can read about a project, and you might not even be reading about what you're doing in the project. It's just like,
Mhm.
how is this project going? Is it going to progress? Like, nothing to do
Mhm.
with sort of more of your direct input, and it
Right.
opens things up for us. It's far more versatile. So perhaps it's a good practice for people as well, is to like do some readings about stuff that's less self-focused in some
Mhm.
senses, and have a play around with it.
I recommend, if you're struggling with court cards, use a deck that does not have people in it. Use a deck that is, you know, completely scenic, or has plants or animals or something else to stand in place for those people, because as soon as you see a face, there is that human inherent want to personify that
And to
person.
place them as well in what you
Yes, to
think
play.
that feature means, who it reminds you of, you know, our bias about their age, how they're
Mhm.
dressed, what they're doing.
I think next time we're going to be on your channel.
Yeah,
So, and I don't know what we're doing, so, like, that'll be determined.
we'll
I
decide.
Yeah, we'll decide. But as always, like, if you have suggestions, you have certain things or questions, I think we did talk about at some point doing, like, a Q&A one where, like, just send us your questions and we'll just sit and kinda go through those at some point. But I feel like we kind of need to get through kind of like our whole kind of base discussion of tarot first. Then we'll hit up all your questions. But in the
Yeah.
meantime, if you have them, you can drop them in the comments. We will save them for later on. Definitely things we can talk about or answer specific questions and things like that.
Yeah.
Um, we're bouncing back and forth between our two channels.
Yeah, so keep an eye, and I think we've both playlisted the whole series on both of our
Mhm.
channels as well. So you'll be able to find all the videos on one channel playlist, whoever's you're
Mhm.
on anyway. So
Yeah, yeah, we both have it. So, well, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with me. It was so fun.
thank you. I always enjoy myself, so thank
Yeah,
you.
it's always fun. And I guess we will see you all next time, I think next month, but let's just say next time, next time on Tegan's channel
Next month or so.
or so. Yeah. So, like, links and all that, like, y'all know, links below, all the goodies.
Yeah.
Same old thing. Alrighty. Well, I guess we'll chat with y'all soon.